My name is Richard Hayes Phillips. Like most of us in this fledgling election integrity movement, I used to have a life. It was a very peaceful, idyllic life. As an acoustic musician and poet and songwriter, as a trailblazer and trail maintenance worker in the Adirondack Mountains of New York and the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. Sometimes I even used my PhD in geomorphology as a field geologist. But I didn't trust the election results even on election night. At the time that it became apparent that neither candidate could win without Ohio, J. Kenneth Blackwell strode onto the national stage. I saw this with my own eyes on CBS News. And he stated that there were 155,000 ballots still to be counted in Ohio. These were provisional ballots. They were from all over the place. They could not possibly overcome the margin between Bush and Kerry, and that Kerry ought to concede. I thought that was rather inappropriate coming from the chief election official in the state of Ohio, who coincidentally was the state co-chair of the Bush-Cheney campaign. He also stated that the boards of elections would not be allowed to begin counting provisional ballots for 11 days, which it later turned out contradicted his own directive of the day before, when he told the boards they could start counting these ballots right away. During that 11-day period, no doubt the pressure upon Kerry to concede would have mounted, and so the next day, John Kerry conceded the election. CBS News had declined to call Ohio for Bush. They left it white on their map. They said that there were more like 250,000 uncounted votes in Ohio. So I searched the website of then Secretary of State J. Kenneth Blackwell looking for the voter turnout data. Voter turnout is ballots cast divided by registered voters, expressed as a percentage. What I really wanted was ballots cast. And I found these data already tucked away in the historical archives section of Blackwell's website, and through the sophisticated mathematical technique of subtraction, I took the total ballots cast county by county and subtracted the total votes counted for president county by county, and found that yes, indeed, there were another 93,000 votes cast not by provisional voters, but by regular voters at the polls, for which no vote had been counted for president. So there were 248,000 uncounted votes in Ohio at the time that John Kerry conceded the election. And what annoyed me about this was not the fortunes of the candidates, but rather the notion that some people's votes count and some people's votes don't count. So 10 days after the election, I received an unsolicited email from Fernwoods. Well, Fernwoods turned out to be Karen Giles, who lives on a mountaintop in Pennsylvania. She had just added me to her massive emailing list, and she's something of a clearinghouse of information, and she sent to me numbers from the homepage of the website of the Cuyahoga County Board of Elections, where Cleveland is located. And the numbers were clearly wrong. They were reporting 250,000 more ballots cast than registered voters. Well, so I called up the Board of Elections, and they told me not to worry about it. They said that this was a data entry error, something about counting absentee ballots twice, but that it didn't carry over to the candidates' vote totals. So that evening, naturally, being an inquisitive type, I started downloading the candidates' vote totals. Now, there's 1,435 precincts in Cuyahoga County. I already knew from having grown up near Albany, New York, which had the longest standing political machine of any city in the country, longer than Chicago, that elections are stolen at the precinct level. But alas, I have dial-up access. It took about 4 hours to download these results, and I got up at maybe 2 in the morning and looked at them, and I immediately saw disturbing numbers of an entirely different sort. There were extraordinary numbers of votes turning up in some precincts in Cleveland in the columns of third-party presidential candidates whom I had never heard of. In one ward, it turned out to be 2 precincts in the same polling place. More than 30% of the vote had gone to Michael Badnarik in one precinct, more than 40% of the vote to Michael Perutka in another precinct. No offense to these gentlemen, but I had to look them up on the web. So I downloaded the precinct results from the 2000 election, and I saw that these were precincts that had voted 92, 95, even 98% for Al Gore in the 2000 election. So now I knew these were carry votes that were shifting to other candidates. I didn't know how, I didn't know why, but it made me a witness to a crime. And my mother had taught me that a witness must come forward. So Fernwoods put me in touch with Bob Fitrakis, publisher of the Columbus Free Press, and I remember 4 things he told me in that first phone call. He said, "This is the very sort of attention to detail that we need. We'll publish your work." He said, "This is the most difficult thing you will ever do because there is a different story in every county." He said, "This is the most important thing you will ever do." And he said, "This will make you famous." I did the work anyway. Bob gave me many leads, nearly all of which turned out to be true. I'll tell you some of them here, and they've been alluded to in the movie, but we know more detail about it now than we did when Dorothy Fadiman was doing her initial filming. Why were the lines so long at the polls in Columbus, up the stairs, out the door, down the block, around the corner in a cold November rain? Because 122 voting machines were never delivered to any polling place anywhere. It isn't just what Matthew Damschroeder said on this phone that there weren't enough voting machines. They deliberately withheld 122 voting machines. There were 68 that never left the warehouse, and another 54 which were scheduled to be delivered. We have the redacted list with the serial numbers. All of them were supposed to be delivered to precincts in Columbus, the Democratic stronghold in the county. And it was an easy task to calculate what the vote count might have been if all the machines had been delivered and distributed in an equitable manner based upon the percentages of the votes that were ultimately awarded to Bush and Kerry, ward by ward or town by town. I calculated that the discriminatory allocation of voting machines resulted in a net loss of 17,000 votes for John Kerry in Columbus alone. The Columbus Dispatch, in an attempt to discredit us, said, "Oh, no, we don't think it was 17,000 votes. We think it was more like 15,000 votes." I regard that as verification of my work. Thank you very much. I should add here that Matthew Schroeder, the director of the Franklin County Board of Elections, used to be the chairman of the Franklin County Republican Party. And there was an emergency hearing on Election Day, and Schroeder testified under oath that all voting machines had been deployed. Another story Bob Fitrakis told me had to do with electronic voting machines. Bob convened a public hearing shortly after the election with notaries public present to collect sworn affidavits from voters who felt they had been disenfranchised. In Columbus, the push-button electronic machines were malfunctioning in this way. Many voters complained that they would push a button for carry, and then the carry vote would fade away from the screen, and they would end up casting no vote for president. It was a pretty easy task to estimate how many votes were lost in this way. There was a much higher percentage of undervotes, that is, no vote for president, than there had been in the 2000 election. So my estimate is that Kerry lost another 3,000 votes this way, but it was even worse in Youngstown, Ohio, in Mahoning County. You saw this. I remember talking to Dorothy Fadiman about this early on, where many voters complained that they would touch the screen for Kerry on the touchscreen machines and Bush would actually light up. There were never any complaints of Bush votes going to Kerry. It was always Kerry to Bush. And most of the complaints on the election protection website were precinct specific, and most of those were in wards 1 and 2. And there was one precinct in particular which enabled me to show how and why it happened. In precinct 2G, I believe it was, there were 6 complaints. 3 voters on 2 different machines complained that they had to scroll through twice or even 5 times in order to get their vote for John Kerry to register. Another 3 voters complained that they never saw a presidential choice appear on the screen. And so they voted for the other offices and filed complaints. Now, shouldn't there be at least 3 undervotes for president in that precinct? If 3 voters went to the polls, voted on a touch screen, and never saw a choice appear for president, there were none. According to the official results, every single person who touched a screen in that precinct had a vote recorded for president, even if they never saw a presidential choice appear on the screen. And it is my judgment that these machines were programmed to default to candidate Bush. If you chose not to vote for president or never got the chance to vote for president, you were voting for Bush. And immediately after I published that paper, I received 71 similar complaints from South Florida, from Miami-Dade, Palm Beach, and Broward counties, 2004, from voters who complained of their votes for Democratic candidates flipping to Republican candidates for both President and United States Senate. Another interesting story was Miami County, Ohio, a Republican county in the west central part of the state. This is not where Miami of Ohio University is located. People always ask me that. In Miami County, on election night, after 100% of the precincts had reported, another 19,000 votes appeared in the totals. This brought George Bush's margin of victory to 16,000 votes exactly, 16000. And the percentages for the candidates remained nearly unchanged. One of them gained or dropped 0.03% The other one was exactly the same to the hundredths of a percent, almost as if the optical scanners were programmed to produce a specific margin of victory, a quota at the percentages that the candidates had earned. So I thought, gee, wouldn't this raise the percentage turnout perilously close to 100% in some of these precincts? It took until December 8th to actually obtain the official results for Miami County, but when I got them, yes indeed, in Concord Southwest, the official turnout was 98.55%. 679 out of 689 registered voters were said to have cast ballots. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever been engaged in get out the vote activities, but that isn't possible. You can't turn out 98.55% of the registered voters. For starters, 10 or more of them have died or moved away and can't vote. There's one other story that I heard early on that I will tell you here, and this I got from Cliff Arnebeck, an attorney working with Bob Fitrakis, and this is what Jesse Jackson has forever dubbed the Connolly anomaly. This takes a bit of time to explain, but it's important because there are large numbers involved here. Ellen Connolly was a little-known African-American municipal judge from Cleveland who had never run a county-wide race. And she was recruited to run for the Democratic nomination for Chief Justice of the Ohio Supreme Court, and she won the primary and was on the November ballot against a well-financed white male incumbent named Thomas Moyer, who had won the Republican primary. Ellen Connolly did very well. According to the official results, she got 47% of the vote. John Kerry officially got 49% of the vote, so both races were close. But roughly, for every 10 voters who made a choice for president, only 8 made a choice for Chief Justice, and that is to be expected. Down-ticket races do not draw as many votes as the top of the ticket. So, since both races were close, you would expect the presidential candidates to get more votes than the Chief Justice candidates in county after county across Ohio. But there were 12 counties in southwestern Ohio, traditionally Republican counties, where John Kerry was awarded fewer votes than Ellen Connolly. Not just a smaller percentage, fewer votes. In 3 of these counties, Claremont, Butler, and Warren, all of which surround Hamilton County where Cincinnati is located in the southwest corner of the state, in those 3 counties, Claremont, Butler, and Warren, George Bush piled up a margin of victory that accounted for his entire statewide margin. He carried those 3 counties by more than his margin of victory statewide. So he owes his reelection to these counties. When I looked at the precinct results, and they varied wildly, there were some precincts where Kerry did run ahead of Connolly and others when he ran far behind her. You could not account for George Bush's vote totals unless at least 13,500 people voted for both a black liberal judge from Cleveland for Chief Justice and for George W. Bush for president. And I hadn't seen the ballots yet. These were just precinct results. So this was the most conservative assumption possible. I was assuming that every single person who voted for Chief Justice Moyer voted for Bush, and every single person who didn't vote for Chief Justice voted for Bush. There were a minimum of 13,500 voters in those 3 counties who voted for Connolly and Bush. Now, or else the official results were not true and correct. Now, when I tried to figure out how many there really were, I noticed that in the 12 Connolly anomaly counties, Ellen Connolly got 43% of the vote. In the other 61 counties carried by Bush, Ellen Connolly got 43% of the vote. There was no significant difference in those percentages. So the question was, why did Kerry perform so poorly in those 12 counties? And if he had gotten the same percentage there that he got in the other counties carried by Bush, he would have gotten 60,000 more votes. Bush would have gotten 60,000 fewer votes, and there's your margin. That's a 120,000 vote shift. So we were looking at numbers that could account for Bush's margin of victory in the state that decided the presidential election. So we challenged the election before the Ohio Supreme Court. I was deposed for 4 hours in a lonely hotel room before a court reporter, but we never got a hearing. There was no discovery of evidence, no deposition of hostile witnesses. Under Ohio law, the Chief Justice gets to hear election challenges all by his lonesome. You can appeal his decision to the full court, but if he doesn't give you a hearing, there's nothing to appeal. And I thought it came with rather poor grace for Thomas Moyer to decline to hear our challenge to the alleged victory of George W. Bush, given that we were also challenging the alleged victory of Chief Justice Thomas Moyer. Well, the election was challenged on the floor of the House, of course, when the late Congresswoman Stephanie Tubbs Jones stepped forward to challenge the election. She was the first public official who had received my writings because those precincts where the Kerry votes had shifted to third-party candidates were in her district, and she had a right and a need to know. But during this period of time, I had a lot of help. I'd gotten on the radio in Berkeley, and numerous people heard me and began collecting precinct results for me from county after county in Ohio, more than 50 out of 88, and they would turn them into tables and spreadsheets for me to make my life a bit easier. And they were so enthusiastic, they collected the results from 82% of the precincts in Ohio, so I kept analyzing them even after there was no hope of overturning the results. When I would get invited to national conferences, I'd like to do another paper. I remember looking at other Connolly anomaly counties, besides Claremont, Butler, and Warren, and these were two of my favorites. In Auglaize County, which used electronic voting machines, the deputy director of the Board of Elections resigned in humiliation about 3 weeks before the election because a technician from the ES&S voting machine company had gained unauthorized access to their central tabulator. And when I looked at the precinct results, I found that Kerry had run behind not just Ellen Connolly, but almost the whole Democratic ticket. He got fewer votes than all three losing Democratic candidates for seats on the Supreme Court, and he got fewer votes than the three Democratic candidates who lost in landslides for U.S. Congress, State Representative, and County Commissioner. In one of these precincts, I remember, Kerry got 188 votes and the candidate for Congress got 399. In another of these counties, Mercer County, where on election night, according to the Conyers report, the Board of Elections reported more ballots cast than the total population of the county. Well, they took those numbers down. But when I asked for the precinct results for the November election, they sent me the precinct results for the March primary. I was rather annoyed. When I finally got the precinct results for November, I thought, gee, maybe I should compare it to the primary. After all, I've got the numbers. And there were 4 precincts in Mercer County where Kerry and Edwards were awarded fewer votes in the November election than they had gotten between them in the primary, even though the elections got a much bigger turnout than the primary. So what the election results were telling me was that Bush got the votes of everybody who didn't vote in the primary, all the Democrats who didn't vote for Kerry or Edwards, and even some of the people who did vote for Kerry and Edwards, or else the official results were not true and correct. There was another curious occurrence in the Connolly anomaly counties. In 3 of them, Kerry was awarded fewer votes than Al Gore had gotten in 2000. Now, Al Gore pulled out of Ohio in 2000, a month before the election, to concentrate his efforts on Florida. And there was a much bigger turnout in 2004, in fact, a 15% increase in these counties. So what the official results were telling me was that Bush got all the new voters, all the Nader voters, because Ralph Nader had been disqualified from the ballot in 2004, and some of the Gore voters, or the equivalent, or else the official results were not true and correct. I did another paper for a conference in Houston in the summer of 2005, or 2006, no, 2005. And this I satirically called Log Cabin Republicans in Ohio. Ohio was one of several states that had a proposed constitutional amendment on the ballot to ban gay marriage or anything resembling it. It was known as Issue 1, and it passed overwhelmingly with 61% of the vote. And almost everybody voted on it. There were very few undervotes or no votes for president, for Issue 1. So if 61% of the people voted for Issue 1 and only 51% voted for Bush, you would expect Issue 1, the ban on gay marriage, to get more votes than Bush in county after county across Ohio. But there were 3 counties out of 88, by definition an anomaly, where Bush got more votes than Issue 1, a lot more votes. 3 of the most conservative counties in Ohio, Delaware County, and yet again, Claremont and Warren counties. You couldn't account for George Bush's vote totals in those 3 counties unless there were at least 10,000 gay-friendly Bush voters. And again, this was a minimum, because for every person who voted for John Kerry and voted to ban gay marriage, and there must have been many because the ban passed with 61% of the vote, there would have to be yet another gay-friendly Bush voter. This is the article that brought me to the attention of Rolling Stone magazine. I got an email from a contributing editor named Tim Dickinson who asked me if I would be willing to be interviewed. I'm a musician. That was a really easy call. So I'm on the phone at length with Tim Dickinson, and he says, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is writing an article for Rolling Stone magazine on the 2004 election in Ohio. Would you be willing to resume your research? So I went back to Ohio, out of pocket as usual, to investigate for Rolling Stone magazine whether or not the voter rolls in Cuyahoga County, where Cleveland is located, had been purged after the 2000 election. And I found that 168,000 names had been removed from the voter rolls, including 64,000 in Cleveland alone. More than 30% of the registered voters in entire wards in Cleveland. Now, there's a reason to purge the voter rolls. People do die or move away, and you don't want somebody else voting in their place. Even in Ohio, the counties have the option of putting you on an inactive list if you have not voted or shown any other activity in the last 4 years. And then you're still allowed to vote. You've got to not vote for another 4 years before they take you off. But not in Cleveland. In Cuyahoga County, they simply remove you from the voter rolls if they want to, if you haven't voted in the last 4 years. So the percentage of voters purged, I should say the percentage of registered voters purged, in ward after ward and town after town ought to correlate with the percentage of registered voters who hadn't voted in the last 4 years. That's why you purge the rolls. And the best indicator would be the previous presidential election because it draws the biggest turnout. But that's not what we found. Rather, generally speaking, this was the correlation. The greater the percentage of the vote won by Al Gore in 2000, the greater the percentage of voters purged. Democratic wards were targeted for partisan political purposes in the #1 Democratic stronghold in Ohio. I don't know how many of those people still lived there and were still interested and tried to vote in November 2004, but I know that none of them would have had their votes counted. Because if you weren't on the voter rolls, your provisional ballot didn't count. It was during this time in the spring of 2006 that the Ohio Attorney General, Jim Petro, ruled that the ballots were in fact public record. I had wanted to look at the ballots for a very long time. And so I started sending public records requests to the most suspect counties, asking to audit the most suspect precincts. I knew where they were. I'd examined precinct results from 82% of the state. And I need to pause for a minute here and discuss the whole idea of an audit, because there seems to be some confusion as to what this means. There are people who want you to believe that recounting the ballots for a small percentage of precincts chosen at random is an audit. No, that is a spot check. When the IRS audits your taxes, you don't get to decide what documents to provide them. They want it all, and we wanted it all. We wanted ballots, poll books, voter signature books, ballot accounting charts, packing slips, invoices, whatever we could get that would help us to determine if the Ohio election was free and fair or if the Ohio election was rigged. I will divide this rest of the talk into blue counties and red counties. We audited both. We did not find red counties rigged for Bush and blue counties rigged for Kerry. We found red and blue counties rigged for Bush. The methodologies differed, which is exactly what Bob Fitrakis had told me in that first phone call, that this is the most difficult thing I would ever do because there was a different story in every county. There were clean and upright counties in Ohio, too. I could vouch for some of them because they happened to give me enough precinct results to make a valid comparison with another election. So I don't mean to cast aspersions on boards of elections in general, but there are some very corrupt ones in Ohio. Okay, that's probably better. These are punch card ballots from Cleveland, and this will answer the question as to how so many votes intended for Kerry ended up in the columns of other candidates. You will notice there are no names on the punch cards, just numbers and perforated rectangles corresponding to them. The numbers actually appear on a booklet that is attached to the punch card voting machine. Great big letters with numbers and arrows directing the voter as to where to punch for that candidate. In Cleveland and in other major cities in Ohio, there were many polling places where multiple precincts voted in the same building. And in Ohio, by law, the sequence, the order in which candidates' names appear on the ballot or on the ballot pages on punch card machines must rotate from precinct to precinct. This is all in the name of fairness because it is believed that so many voters are so stupid or so lazy that they do not read through the whole list of names and they vote for the first person listed even in a presidential election. So, to give every candidate an equal opportunity to be listed first on the ballot, they rotate the names not by county but by precinct. And so if you're in a multiple precinct polling place and you take your correct punch card ballot for your precinct and bring it to the wrong voting booth where the names are listed in a different order You think you're voting for Kerry. The booklet tells you you're voting for Kerry. You're punching where the arrow's pointing. But when you put that ballot in the correct ballot box, the tabulator is going to count it for another candidate. The same thing would happen for Bush voters, but remember, these are heavily Democratic precincts, traditionally voting more than 90% Democratic. In fact, even with this hemorrhage of votes from Kerry to other candidates, he still carried Cleveland with 83% of the vote. So shifting of votes from one candidate to another in Cleveland by accident or design would hurt Kerry much more than it would hurt Bush. Now, in this polling place, in one precinct, Kerry was in position number 2 in the left-hand column, and maybe I can do it with the arrow. And Bush and was in position number 6 in the other precinct. Yeah, I hate those things. So, in this precinct, Kerry was in position number 2. If you brought your ballot to the other precinct, you'd be punching number 6 thinking it was for Kerry, and his vote would go to Michael Peroutka, who ended up with 215 votes in this precinct. There are no punches on these cards telling the tabulator what precinct is being counted. They're only identified in writing, generally in print, on the back side of the card. More on that later. You have to trust the Board of Elections to keep the cards straight. But here's the other precinct in the same polling place, and we see the same pattern with punches for number 2 and number 6. In this precinct, Kerry was in position number 6. And if you punched number 2 because you went to the wrong voting machine, your vote for Kerry would migrate to Michael Badnarik, who received 178 votes in this precinct. And it wasn't just Badnarik and Peroutka. Those are just the examples I could see in the precinct results. One of the questions was why so many ballots were not even counted as votes for president. Some of them were votes for Kerry or occasionally for Bush, migrating to candidate disqualified. That would be Ralph Nader. By this time, we were sorting out ballots that would not be counted for Kerry or Bush to find out why not. And this is in Precinct 6M in Cleveland, where candidate disqualified, or Ralph Nader, ended up with more than 80 votes. As if 80 people lined up for an hour or more to vote for candidate disqualified for president. Now, the way the rotation happened to work, it was set by law. Everybody knew it, including the vote riggers. If you were in a polling place with 2 consecutively numbered precincts, if voters from this precinct went to that precinct, their Kerry votes would go to Nader. If voters from that precinct went to this precinct, their Kerry votes would go to Bush. And in the other precinct in the same polling place, 6L, we saw cards punched number 10 for Kerry, and we saw cards punched for number 8, which is the position Kerry was in the other precinct. So those votes were counted for Bush. And how do we know they were intended for Kerry? For one thing, Nader got a bit more than 80 votes in one precinct, and Bush got a bit more than 80 votes in the other, having received almost no votes in one precinct in the polling place, and he gets 80 in the other. But also I looked at the absentee ballots. Those were punched in the privacy of people's homes. They didn't go to any wrong voting machine. And that wasn't easy to do. Absentee ballots in Cleveland are not counted at the precinct level. They're thrown into a great big box according to the combination of districts you live in, congressional, state senate, and state assembly district. So I had to paw through 4,000 absentee ballots and sort them out by precinct. And I got through 14 precincts, including this one, when Gwen Dillingham, the deputy director under Michael Vu, barged into the room and ordered the Republican and Democrat who were observing me not to let me touch any more absentee ballots. I found this behavior rather extreme. But then maybe I shouldn't be surprised. Michael Vu, the director of the Cuyahoga County Board of Elections, Michael Vu, was a Democrat, at least in name only, and oversaw all the problems that happened in the elections in 2004 and 2006, was eventually dismissed. In fact, the current Secretary of State, Jennifer Brunner, has obtained the resignations of the entire board in Cleveland. Well, Michael Vu is now working for the Board of Elections in San Diego County, California. They just move these guys around like pedophile priests from one diocese to another. Which is why Patty Schaefer thinks we should have a National Elections Offenders Registry. Anyway, so we now have photographic proof that Kerry votes went to Badnarik, Perutka, Nader, and Bush in Cleveland. And it wasn't just Cleveland. Here's ballots from Akron, Ohio. The same thing. Kerry was in position number 10 in one precinct and in position number 8 in the other. And these are Kerry votes that went to Nader, who ends up with 66 votes in this precinct, even though he wasn't even on the ballot. And this was sometimes not by accident, but by design. The voter signature books in Cuyahoga County have these pink memo sheets where the poll workers are supposed to write unusual occurrences that happen at the polls. This one says 11 o'clock, inspector override, vote at any vacant booth. 4 o'clock, inspector came back, instructed voter to vote at precinct. During this 5-hour period in that polling place, more than 100 Kerry votes shifted to Badnarik, Perutka, and Nader. Now, I asked the Division of Candidate and Voter Services about this in the Board of Elections office in Cleveland. They didn't know anything about it. There are no roving inspectors authorized to go from polling place to polling place and override the trained precinct judges to make sure they let voters go to the wrong voting booth so their votes will go to the wrong candidate. I would like to know who this roving inspector was, who he worked for, and how many polling places he went to. And this wasn't the only problem in the multiple precinct polling places. Each precinct had its own table and therefore its own line of voters. And if the lines were out the door and you got in the wrong line because no one was there to direct you to the right line, and you stood in line for an hour or maybe 4 hours and got up to the table, you would find that you're not on the voter rolls. And if they didn't tell you, oh, you're in the wrong line, you need to go to the back of that line and start over, they would give you a provisional ballot instead, but it wouldn't count because you voted in the wrong precinct. You were in the right building, but you were at the wrong table, so your vote didn't count. More on that later. The other way that votes were rigged in blue counties, and this answers the question as to why so many punch card ballots showed no vote for president. I wrote this up for John Kerry's brother, Cameron Kerry, early on, never got an answer, showing that the 93,000 uncounted ballots, most of them punch cards, came disproportionately from blue counties, especially from precincts that had voted overwhelmingly for John Kerry. The precincts with the highest percentage of ballots with no vote counted for president had gone for Kerry by margins of 12-1 in Cleveland, 8-1 in Cincinnati. These were the Democratic strongholds where this was happening. Well, it was assumed by most interested parties who didn't actually look at the evidence that it must be hanging chads. No. We photographed or photocopied undervotes or overvotes. Undervotes with no punch for president, overvotes with 2 or more punches for president. In 8 urban counties, we saw, I believe, 20 hanging chads in 8 counties. I think by 2004, voters knew to examine their cards after they'd voted because of the Florida debacle. Instead, what we saw, most of those uncounted ballots, more than half, in some counties 2/3, had 2 or more punches for president in the first column. 1 for a major party candidate, 1 for a minor party candidate. 1 for Kerry or Bush, but usually Kerry because these were heavily Democratic precincts, and 1 for Badnarik or Perutka, or both. Now, to assume that 6, 8, 10, 12% of the voters, even 19% in some precincts, made the same 2 errors, that they punched for Kerry or Bush, and then went and punched for another candidate for president, not knowing who the person was or what office they were voting on, strains credulity. And there are voters who swore that they were given punch cards already punched for president. And if they had put them in the machines, they would have been ruining their own ballots by making a second punch. Now, I don't know how many of these double punches were fraudulent, but this, I remember, is a Cincinnati precinct. There were 24 ballots not counted for president, and 23 of them were punched for Kerry and for a third-party candidate. There was 1 genuine undervote with no attempt to vote for president. We have photographs of more than 2,000 of these ballots, representing 1/8 of the data set in those 8 counties. I'm not saying there's 24,000 double punch ballots. I haven't examined them all, but there could be. Most of those ballots still exist. They're in the custody of Ohio Secretary of State Jennifer Brunner. Anyone could look at other precincts. Here are double punch ballots in Akron, 2 punches in the left-hand column. Double punch ballots in Dayton, 2 punches in the left-hand column. And Dayton is extra special. Montgomery County was the only county in the state of Ohio that destroyed all of their ballots, voted and unused, even after receiving a federal court order not to do so. No, they're not in jail. Double punch ballots in Warren City in Trumbull County, Ohio. Double punch ballots in Canton City in Stark County, Ohio. This one, by the way, this hot pink ballot, is a remake. Boards of elections in Ohio are entitled to remake ballots that they don't feel are being read properly by the punch card tabulator or the optical scanner. They are supposed to initial them, both a Republican and a Democrat. They're supposed to number them so they can be matched up with these spoiled ballots that were allegedly being duplicated. And not one county in Ohio could produce the spoiled ballots that their remakes were allegedly duplicating. Now, what's the reason to remake this ballot? There's no punches for anything. They need to remake a ballot where the voter didn't vote for anything? The only punches on this ballot are the three punches in a triangular array in the bottom that appear in just the same way in every punch card in every precinct in every punch card county in Ohio, signifying absolutely nothing. They could have different arrays of punches at that part of the punch card to let the tabulator know which precinct is being counted, but no, that's not how they did it in Ohio. There are no punches telling the tabulator which precinct is being counted, but those 3 punches might serve to obfuscate an extra punch in the presidential column, or in this case, 2 extra punches. Everybody in Ohio got pre-punched ballots. It's just that some of them had more than 3 punches. Some of them had 4 or 5. Now, if you're going to rig red counties in Ohio, you can't rig them the same way. You're not going to pre-punch ballots because Bush is going to be the net loser of the votes. You're not going to let people go to the wrong voting machine unless by accident, which happened probably on 2 occasions in red counties in Ohio. So you have to have different means to rig the election. I'm going to skip that one. In Miami County, Ohio, one of 2 counties that we audited that used optical scanners, the favorite method of rigging ballots was to take ballots with no mark for president, undervotes for president, and fill it in for Bush. This is not the same hand that marked these other offices. We saw quite a few of these. Miami County, Ohio had the lowest percentage of undervotes for president, no vote for president, of any of the 88 counties in Ohio, and this would be one of the reasons why. We also observed in Miami County 570 remakes, all in a nice box, labeled not November 2nd, but labeled December 16th. These were recount remakes. The Democratic Party didn't see fit to challenge this election, but the Green and Libertarian parties, God bless them, did challenge this election. And they raised the money to pay for a recount of every county in Ohio, and they didn't get it. Rather, the county boards of elections were to choose at random in front of the observers precincts amounting to 3% of the ballots cast, and count those ballots by hand, and if the hand count matched the official results, then they could run the other 97% of the ballots through the optical scanner or through the punch card tabulators and go home. Well, the observers for the Green Party in Miami County noticed these remakes. They estimated there were 550 of them, which is a really good guess. There were 570. And they observed that some of the choices were questionable, which tells me that these ballots were being remade before their eyes. Now, even with 570 recount remakes amounting to more than 1% of the ballots cast in the whole county, the numbers still didn't match. The hand count still failed to match the official results. So J. Kenneth Blackwell, the Secretary of State, dispatched one of his operatives to Miami County to interpret election law for them. And he said, oh, the hand count doesn't have to match the official results. The hand count only has to match today's tabulator count. This is an exercise in hand counting. This is not a recount of the presidential election, in other words. Now, to us, the big question in Miami County was turnout. This is the county with what became known as the Saddam Hussein-like turnout of 98.55% in Concord Southwest. This is a ballot accounting chart. I'm going to start with this one, Bethel South Central. This one actually adds up. This is what they're supposed to do at the polling places. You see that box in the upper left-hand part of the page. 1,075 ballots received. That's filled in by the Board of Elections in black ink. And you account for all the ballots through the day. There's 935 regular ballots, which should match the number of signatures in the book. 0 walk-in ballots, that means provisional ballots, and 4 spoiled and defaced ballots where the voter made a mistake, went up to the desk, asked for another ballot, and the spoiled ballots get put in a separate envelope and are not to be counted. And there's 140 unused ballots left over, and it totals 1,075. So far, so good. Note, 0 walk-in or provisional voters. Bethel South Central. Here are the provisional ballot statistics for Bethel South Central. 17 provisional ballots approved when there were no provisional voters at the polls. In fact, 10 of these provisional voters were registered in other counties. Clark, Montgomery, Shelby, and they had their provisional ballots counted. All but one of them, who wasn't even registered in Montgomery County, so they decided not to count his ballot. Now, mind you, if you're in a blue county in a big city in Ohio and you are in the right building but at the wrong table, your provisional ballot does not count. But in Miami County, there were hundreds of provisional ballots counted from voters who were registered in the wrong county altogether. There were 2 provisional ballots counted for voters who were registered out of state, one from Florida and one from New York City. And this is not equal protection under the law. We need the same rules in red counties as in blue counties. Here's another. Oh, I need to go back to this. It also says in the upper left-hand corner, no stubs. I don't know how it works in Arizona. I'm learning about it. But in Ohio, except in the most corrupt counties, here's how it works. The paper ballots have a stub, a strip of paper that's perforated. It's got a number on it, and that number appears only on the stub and not on the ballot. And the poll workers are supposed to write that stub number in the signature book next to your name, and they enter you into the poll book, which is the sequential list of voters, and the stub numbers are written there as well. And when you put your ballot in the box, the stub is torn off and put in the box separately or put in a separate box. And if the ballots are recounted or audited, the stub numbers on the torn off strips from the voted ballots are supposed to match the stub numbers in the signature book, and the stub numbers still attached to the unused ballots are supposed to not match the numbers in the signature book. And that is how you verify that the ballots being examined are the same ones that were handed to the voters at the polls. And you're supposed to have the stub numbers in the signature book, the ballot stubs torn off and preserved, and all the unused ballots preserved. And if you don't save those 3 records, you can't verify your vote, unless maybe by process of eliminations. So this was one of numerous precincts in Miami County where they did not preserve the stub numbers. Here's another ballot accounting chart. I remember picking this precinct, Troy City, Precinct 4F, because when I compared the 2004 results with 2000, it looked like Bush had about 100 extra votes in a county with almost no increase in population in any town in the county. And note on the accounting chart, 445 ballots received, and I have no idea where the other 99 came from to bring them up to 544. The explanation that was given for the bizarre turnout percentages in Miami County was that the Board of Elections held back some of the ballots on Election Day, and then when some of the polling places were at risk of running out of ballots due to unexpectedly high turnout, the Board of Elections dispatched teams of volunteer Boy Scouts to deliver the ballots, and those darn Boy Scouts must have brought the wrong ballots to the wrong precinct, and that's how it all got messed up. Well, I used to be a Boy Scout. I really wasn't entertained by having Boy Scouts fingered as the culprits in what might turn out to be a vote rigging scheme. So I compared the ballot stub numbers for the various precincts in the towns where I thought at least one of the ballot boxes might have been stuffed, and was able to exonerate the Boy Scouts and show that they were not the culprits. The evidence is tedious except for this. in order to account for the turnout in Concord Southwest of 98.55%, it would have been rather difficult to blame it on the Boy Scouts because there was more than one polling place, and the Boy Scouts would have had to have confused a Nazarene church with a United Auto Workers meeting hall. Notice, one spoiled and defaced ballot in that ballot accounting chart. One person messed up his or her ballot, went back up to the desk and asked for another one. So there should be one ballot stub number crossed out and replaced with a new one. Well, why then are there 4 stub numbers crossed out on this one page alone? 2 up at the top, 1 farther down, and another one here. I remember there were more than 20 ballot stub numbers altered in this voter's signature book, and what would be the reason for that if there was only one spoiled ballot? Here's another ballot accounting chart. I like this one a lot. Now, how many ballots received? Was it 550 or was it 630? How many ballots were cast? Let's see, was it 505 or was it 390 or was it 496? I mean, those numbers aren't even close. It's not like down here where they counted 124 and redid it and saw it was 123. That's understandable. But when you're off by about 100, now I picked this precinct because I thought there were 110 extra votes for Bush. Well, if you look in the upper right-hand corner, this dutiful poll worker did what he's supposed to do and explained the reason for the discrepancy. There's 390 ballots cast in Tip City Precinct F. It's Monroe Township, but it's Tip City. And 106 ballots from Tip City Precinct J put in the same ballot box by orders of Kelly Gillis. Well, I found that rather curious, especially when I found out that Kelly Gillis was the chairman of the Miami County Democratic Party. And it looked like there were 110 extra votes for Bush in this precinct. Here's the voter signature book for Tip City J. And those are 2 of the per Kelly Gillis voters who didn't get to vote in Tip City J. Somebody just wrote Tip F in the signature book. Now notice, these 2 have the same surname, Ahmed. They've got the same street address. I found 48 or 50 of these couples where they were divided. One of them voted in one precinct and one voted in the other. I didn't know who had done the redistricting, but how did they, they drew it right down the middle of the bedroom? So I wanted to know what happened. Well, we found this. There were 3 pieces of scrap paper in the signature book where the per Kelly Gillis voters were made to sign. There's the name, there's the address, these are the signatures. So why couldn't they sign the voter's signature book? Well, naturally, we decided to canvass the precinct, and we went door to door to houses where the married couples had been divided in precincts and asked them what happened, and they all told us the same story. The lines were really long in Tip City J, and so somebody came in and said, okay, everybody whose name begins with A to L or A to M or whatever it was, come with me. And the rest of you still vote here. And they gathered them up and herded them like so many cattle and marched them down the street to the wrong polling place. Now, one of these voters was still in tears 2.5 years later saying, I didn't stand in line for an hour and a half in order to have my vote not count. I knew this isn't where I was supposed to be voting. We asked them, did you put your ballots in the ballot box? Did they carry ballots from the other precinct for you? How did that work? And they said, no, we just handed the ballots to the poll workers. Well, that could be why when I examined the ballots in the Tip City F precinct to which these voters were marched off, I found that the voting pattern changed midway through the deck, which tells you why you cannot alter the sequence of the ballots that you observe. You must not alter the evidence. You might be altering the evidence at a crime scene. You might expect more Democratic voters at some parts of the day and more Republican voters at the other parts of the day, but there should not be an abrupt change in ticket splitting. When I isolated out the Bush ballots in this stack of optical scan ballots, In the top half of the deck, Chief Justice Moyer was beating Ellen Connolly 2-1 among the Bush voters, and in the bottom half of the deck it was 50-50, and that's not even close. So that raised my eyebrows. So here's the voter signature book for Tip City F, from which I retrieved those ballots, the precinct to which the per Kelly Gillis voters were marched. There are no stub numbers in this book. There is no way they can account for those ballots. They cannot verify that those were the ballots issued to the voters on election night. And here's the ballot accounting chart for Tip City J, from which these per Kelly Gillis voters were marched, and there was no attempt to account for the ballots. There's the number of ballots delivered at the beginning of the day, and that's all you get. In Concord Southwest, with the 98.55% turnout, well, if they only had 679 voters, why were 980 ballots delivered at the start of the day? Question mark, question mark. And here's the voter signature book from Concord Southwest, where all but 10 registered voters are said to have voted. You can photograph 2 pages at once. This is pages 20 and 21. There's 13 blanks on this photograph alone. This is one of the photographs I submitted to Judge Marbley in a successful request to get him to protect the surviving ballots from destruction. We photographed every poll book in Miami County and 24 signature books and compared these signatures to the official results. We found that the official results were wrong, not just in the 98.55% turnout precinct, but in all 82 precincts in Miami County. Now, on the day I submitted my public records request by U.S. mail asking for, among other things, this signature book, the deputy director of the Board of Elections, a registered Democrat, resigned. The director, a registered Republican and a former military intelligence operative named Steve Quillen, turned out to be the most cooperative and transparent elections official we encountered in the entire state of Ohio. He even helped with the investigation. He has a computerized database of voter histories, and he commanded his database to tell him how many of the voters then registered in the summer of 2006 were registered in November 2004, and if they voted, precinct by precinct. And he made a printout showing a very good estimate of the percentage turnout in every precinct in Miami County, and we showed up one day, and his first words to us were, "You guys are right." And he handed us the printout showing that the official results were wrong in all 82 precincts of Miami County. There seemed to be a little confusion as to which precinct the Concord Southwest ballots were really from. And I'll show you the next photograph just for amusement. They are supposed to keep the ballots in a dry place, securely locked with a double lock and key. Republicans got one key, Democrats got the other. In Miami County, they put the ballots and signature books and poll books in the powerhouse across the street from the county office building, and the roof caved in, and the pouring rain soaked all the elections records, and that's the first ballot on the top of the deck, or top of the stack. Nor was the building secured. There was only one lock. Even the custodians had the key. One day we showed up and found the key sitting on a chair unattended all day long. Another day, in the late afternoon, a custodian approached us and said, "Do you all have the key, or do you need Steve to lock up for you?" Do I have the key for the ballot room for a presidential election? I don't even live in Ohio. So I had to station Victoria Parks at the door while I went searching through the county office buildings because the Board of Elections was closed, and I finally found somebody else who had the key and was able to lock up the ballot room. Some other Connolly anomaly counties. This is Dark County. That's what the punch card ballots are supposed to look like on the back side. These are actually printed by, not by Dayton Legal Blank. There's a few counties where they're printed by another printer. They're supposed to have the date and the county, the facsimile signatures of the Board of Elections. If they're ballots issued at the polls, they're supposed to have the precinct printed on the back side right about here. These are absentee ballots, which are generally ordered in a batch, and the boards of elections write the precinct number on the back of the ballot, hopefully before they mail it to the voter, so they can't choose after the fact which precinct to count that punch in. But what on earth are these? We found a lot of these in Darke County. Blank ballots with nothing printed on the back side, identified not even by county. These are wild card ballots that could be used on an as-needed basis to stuff the ballot box in any county of their choosing. We photographed the ballots for 9 Connolly anomaly precincts where Kerry got fewer votes than Connolly in Darke County, and we photographed 70 more ballots than the total number issued to the voters. Let me repeat that. More ballots than the total number issued to the voters. And not just 1 or 2 more. This wasn't a matter of somebody forgetting to sign the signature book. This was a lot more. That's called ballot box stuffing. Some of those ballots were never touched by voters, and if some of the ballots are fake, how do we know that any of the ballots are real? Another Connolly anomaly county, Mercer County. These look like they were printed up at the Board of Elections. First of all, it's the only county in Ohio where the county that we audited, where the county name is printed in a dot matrix printer. Secondly, there's 5 signatures instead of 4, which tells me this wasn't done by the professionals at Dayton Legal Blank. But even more interesting, if you look at the second signature, the guy's name is Owen V. Hall, and the first letter of his name is cut off, and not even in a straight line attributable to some scanning problem. This is done by a pair of scissors in a line that curves upward to the left, as if, and with the first 2 letters of somebody else's name sticking out the left-hand side of the signature, as if the whole thing's done from a cut and taped original. I do remember the absentee ballot count in this precinct, Marion West. It was Bush 79, Kerry 6. Yet Ellen Connolly managed to get 22 absentee ballots in this precinct. It would be very interesting to canvass this largely Mennonite precinct and find out if over 90% of them actually voted for the man that brought them the Iraq War, and 22 of them actually voted for a black lady for Chief Justice. On to Claremont County. That was the other optical scanner county that we audited. Oh, and I should mention, too, there were extra ballots in the precincts we audited in Mercer County and in Van Wert County. We found extra absentee ballots in Claremont County. I'm going to zoom in on this a little bit for you. I took this photograph in a dimly lit room. There is actually a little white sticker over the Kerry mark with the Bush mark filled in. The witnesses to the recount in December saw many of these. The Green, Libertarian, and Democratic witnesses wrote out sworn affidavits and confronted the Board of Elections 3 times about this and other problems. At the second confrontation, Bob Drake, the Green Party witness, was taken aside by one of the employees of the Board of Elections who explained to him what happened. She said that on election night, the director of the Board of Elections, Danny Baer, a registered Republican, sent the deputy director, a registered Democrat, home sick and had access to the ballots all by his lonesome and came in with a box full of stickered ballots. And the employees were so frightened of the man that they didn't know what to do. At the third confrontation with the witnesses, Danny Baer admitted attaching the stickers himself. We had to fight with county prosecutors for 79 days to gain access to these ballots with cameras. They wanted to sell us photocopies at great expense, and that would cost these are large pieces of paper. Even if they use ledger-sized paper, it would take 2 copies for one two-sided ballot. The cost would have been exorbitant. And I told an assistant county prosecutor, we know about the altered ballots. She preferred that we call them stickered ballots. And, I said, we will not accept black and white photocopies of black and white ballots with a white sticker on them. We need photographs. We're not taking photocopies of the stickered ballots. And she said, well, there really weren't very many of them. Well, I asked her, how many would that be? And she sent me a letter in writing saying there were fewer than 100 stickered ballots. And she acknowledged that the ballots that the witnesses were observing would have been just in the 3% that were hand counted. So there could have been 3,000 countywide. And so I told her, ma'am, that would be fewer than 100 felonies, and that is why we need to use cameras. Well, this we did. We got to use cameras. After the court agreement in the King Lincoln versus Blackwell case, where federal Judge Marbley ordered the ballots still surviving to be protected from destruction, the current Secretary of State, Jennifer Brunner, took custody of the evidence, and I asked to see this precinct again, and we were allowed to put this ballot on a window to serve as a light table. It changes the color, but there's the mark behind the carry sticker with the Bush mark filled in a distinctly darker writing implement than the other marks on the ballot. And yes, these are marks for Republican candidates, but that's not the voter mistake. They don't get handed stickers if they mess up their ballots. They get a new ballot. In fact, if you go back and look at the full ballot, this is a ticket splitter. These are votes for every Democratic candidate for the Supreme Court: Ellen Connolly, Nancy First, and William O'Neill. Here's another way they altered ballots in Claremont County. This is a vote for Kerry, ruined when somebody literally smeared a mark in next to Michael Badnarik, the Libertarian candidate for president, turning a Bush vote into an overvote. So obviously then, the optical scanners read as an overvote for president any ballot with 2 or more marks for president, right? Wrong. Here's a ballot with marks for Nader and Bush, an interesting combination. This was counted for Bush. The observers to the recount saw this too. They asked why overvotes marked for Kerry were counted as overvotes, and overvotes marked for Bush and Nader were counted as marked for Bush. Well, that's because they were trying to get the hand count to match the tabulator count so that they wouldn't have to recount by hand the whole county and show a whole bunch more stickered ballots. How do I know it was counted for Bush? Because we photographed every ballot for this precinct and compared them to the official results, and we know how many undervotes there were and how many overvotes there were and how many Bush votes there were. These ballots were counted for Bush. So that tells me that the scanners in Claremont County, and they did their own programming, were programmed not even to recognize a mark for Nader, thus allowing elections officials to fill in the Nader ballots for Bush. We didn't find any Kerry and Nader ballots. We didn't find any ballots marked for Nader only. All we found was Nader and Bush. And you know what worries me about that? The very fact that an optical scanner can be programmed not to read a mark for a candidate. Doesn't that mean that maybe it can be programmed not to read every 10th mark or every 50th mark? Can't you program a computer to do anything you want? Here are some signature books. No, not yet. This is a document they gave us at the Claremont County Board of Elections, dated 4 days before the recount. They were supposed to pick the precincts to be hand counted at random in front of everybody. This is dated 4 days before they'd already picked the precincts. Here they are listed out. They picked the smallest precincts in the county because it'd be the easiest ones to get the count to match. But I don't think they picked them on December 10th. I think they picked them before Election Day, and here's my evidence. These are absentee ballots. They look just the same as the regular ballots, except that there's a notation in the upper right-hand corner. A little red rubber-stamped smiley face. This ballot has only one mark. It's just for Bush. Have a nice day. These are from precincts that were machine counted. They weren't among the 3% that were hand counted in December. In every machine counted precinct we audited, we photographed too many of these. We photographed more absentee ballots than the total number issued to the voters. Some of them were never touched by voters, and we don't know which of them are real, if any of them are real. And that's even though the signature books don't tell us which absentee ballots were even returned by the voters in a timely manner. We photographed more absentee ballots than the total number mailed to the voters. But in the absentee ballots in the hand-counted precincts, they all look like this. They're marked by hand with an A in the upper right-hand corner. And the regular and absentee ballots were mixed together on election night and run through the scanners. Why would they be marked differently? Why would there be a different notation on the precincts that just happened to end up getting hand-counted 6 weeks later? Unless they knew which precincts they were going to hand-count if it came to that, so they could leave them alone and survive public scrutiny. Here's some voter signature books from Claremont County. You tell me if you think that this signature of record is matched by this signature of the voter. Here's another one. Here's some signatures of record. Do you think this one's a match? David Farmer. This is one of my favorites up here. Her name is Allison, not Allen. Here's another one, James Taylor. I don't think that's a match either. Those are all just from one precinct. I've got many more of these on a CD that comes with the book with 1,200 photographs of evidence from Ohio. These are under Claremont County in a folder called Easter Eggs. You can go hunt for the signatures. Yeah, I'll get to that in a minute. I have 3 more counties I'm going to touch on. Butler County, Ohio, and southwestern Ohio gave Bush's biggest margin of any county in the state. Not so in the 2000 election, but it did in 2004. When we were photographing punch card ballots in Butler County, a ranking employee of the Board of Elections, an administrative assistant, told us these words: "The punch cards have always worked well for us. The tabulators have always worked well in the past. We have always done our own programming. But for some reason, on the morning of Election Day, a technician from the ES&S voting machine company showed up unannounced at the Board of Elections and reprogrammed all 6 of our tabulators." Well, that could be why a count of the photographed ballots in precinct after precinct that we audited failed to match the tabulator count, not just for president, but for Chief Justice either. And very often, the discrepancy in one form or another amounted to 25 votes or 50 votes, give or take 1 or 2, which told me that this ES&S technician may have rigged the tabulators in the same way that they used to rig the lever machines in Detroit if there were not any citizens observing at the beginning of the day to make sure that all candidates started at 0. They would start their guy at plus 25 and the other guy at minus 25, or their guy at 50 and the other guy at minus 50, probably more precisely 9950. And then at the end of the day, there's exactly the right number of votes cast, so who's any the wiser? Nobody knows better, even in a punch card county, unless some inquisitive citizen volunteers want to come in with digital cameras and start photographing the ballots. So I remember this board employee telling me on our first visit that there was a time when the technicians had access to the ballots because they were in the same room as the voting machines. And if you're going to rig the ballots after the fact to get them to match a rigged tabulator count, then we're likely to see exactly what we found. Runs of ballots, 50 consecutive ballots for Bush on a number of occasions. There was one precinct where there were 50 consecutive punch card ballots for Bush at the top of the deck and 212 consecutive ballots for Bush in the middle of the deck. And that's exactly what you would expect if somebody came in, pawed through the deck of cards, removed 50 carry ballots from this heavily Republican precinct, leaving 212 consecutive Bush ballots behind in that section of the deck, and replaced them with 50 Bush ballots at the top of the deck and forgot to shuffle the cards, which is all he would have had to do to cover his tracks. So we wondered if the same thing had happened in Delaware County, north of Columbus. Delaware first came to my attention because they had a 45% increase in turnout. For every 100 people who voted in the 2000 presidential election, there were 145 in 2004. I know it was the fastest growing county in Ohio, but not that fast. The second reason they came to my attention was because it was Delaware County that went to federal court to try to stop the recount paid for by the Green and Libertarian parties, and it was the Democratic Party that led the charge. And the third thing that came to my attention is they had more gay-friendly Bush voters than any other county in Ohio. So I had a lot of things I wanted to investigate. I will start with the ballots cast. I asked Kim Spangler and Janet Brenneman, the director and deputy director, I'll just call them Kim and Janet, we're on a first-name basis. I asked them how many voters were purged from the rolls, and they said, I asked them for the names of the voters that were purged from the rolls, and they said, well, we don't have that. Once we remove them from the computer, they're gone altogether. There's no record that they were ever on the rolls. Oh, well, yes, we do still have the voter registration cards in a drawer somewhere, but it costs you a lot of money to photocopy them. So I said, okay, Kim, just give me the numbers. How many people did you purge? And she told me how many they purged before and after the election. She said the ones after the election had already been inactive. They could have been purged before. So I constructed a timeline, something I had learned to do from watching the television show Without a Trace. If the timeline doesn't work, somebody's lying. And so I figured out how many registered voters there had been for every primary and every general election from 2000 onward, and I factored in the 2 purges of the voter rolls, and I went back to Kim and Janet and said, all right, y'all had 78,000 registered voters in April 2004 when you purged the rolls. And you had 100,000 registered voters by the October deadline. I want the names. I want the names of all 22,000 voters who registered to vote in a 6-month period to bring your total to 100,000. I know you've still got them because they're still on the rolls. Oh, Kim gave me a spreadsheet, but it was 6,000 names short. They could not account for the 100,000 registered voters they claimed to have in their official results. And this in a county that claimed to have 81% turnout countywide. If they didn't have that many registered voters, then the turnout was really 87% countywide. And if another 6,000 or 7,000 of those were inactive, they're claiming they had a turnout of 93% of their active voters. So I didn't believe the numbers. I wanted to look at ballots. They started to tell us some rather fabulous stories. I asked about the chain of custody, which seems to be a major topic here today. And we were told that on election night, the precinct judges, all by their lonesome, carry the ballots from the polling places to an underground parking garage beneath the Board of Elections, where the ballots are unloaded by teams of volunteer Boy Scouts who bring the ballots not to Kim and Janet to run them through the tabulators, but to an intermediate weigh station where a mentally retarded man is hired to scrape the chads from the ballots. Their words. Well, the timeline doesn't work. Chad Scraper, as we affectionately call him, had 4.5 hours to examine and clean as needed 79,000 ballots. That's about 4 or 5 per second. Now, mind you, when we finally got a chance to examine the ballots in Delaware County, we weren't allowed to touch them. There was a Democrat and a Republican to turn the cards for us, but they hand them over to a mentally retarded man before they're even run through the tabulators. I don't believe it. So they wanted to know just why we wanted to look at the ballots. They were clearly annoyed, and I said, well, you know, I found the election results surprising. There had to be at least 3,000 persons who voted for gay marriage and for George Bush, and maybe twice as many as that. And Kim and Janet must have known about this. They had their explanations all ready, as if rehearsed, and they both told us that they had family members who were gay and proceeded to identify them, which I felt was inappropriate. I think gay people should get to decide for themselves whether or not to reveal their sexual orientation and should not be outed by family members in front of total strangers in the county office building. I then asked them, they then told me that there was a large gay contingent on the Delaware campus. That would be Ohio Wesleyan Methodist University. And then they said that all the Delaware shop owners are gay. They said this 3 times. You know, we're saying, all of them? Yes, all of them. Oh, I did not know that. Yes, all of them. Well, you know, this is their story. We're crime scene investigators. We got to go check it out. So we go downtown and we start asking, you know, going into the stores and asking, is it true y'all are gay? And you know, I'm glad I can lighten up a dark subject. So, you know, the guy at the Sherwin-Williams counter just sort of paces back and forth and says, well, I'm just the manager, I'm not the owner. And we go to the taxi cab company figuring they surely will know they drive people around at all hours of the morning and they've been in business for 110 years. And they told us these words, quote, Delaware is not a gay mecca. So I went to the Visitors Bureau posing as a gay urban professional, and I said, we just drove up the river road from Columbus, and we think it's really beautiful, and we're thinking about moving here, and I would like some brochures on gay-owned and operated restaurants, bed and breakfasts, and campgrounds. Well, they wanted to know whatever made us think they'd have such a thing. Meanwhile, you know, I actually looked at a brochure for a campground and acted disappointed that it wasn't gay-owned and operated. And so they asked, you know, how on earth we thought this. And I said, well, we have it on good authority from the Board of Elections that there's a large gay community in Delaware City. And you know, I said, well, who told you that? Oh, Kim and Janet. Well, you know, the Visitors Bureau couldn't even refer me to a business that flies a rainbow flag. So I began to suspect that the story was not true, that there is no large gay community, and that the election results were fraudulent. So we went back and wanted to look at the ballots, and they were less amused than ever. Not once, not twice, but 5 times the Delaware County Board of Elections called out armed, uniformed paramilitary policemen to try to stop us from looking at the ballots. Welcome to the Soviet Union. I am not easily intimidated. I walked up to this uniformed officer and looked at his shoulder patch to find out just who he was working for. It said Global Security Services. I went back to the law office and ran a web search, and their web page, since taken down, boasted that they are comprised of former Secret Service, FBI, CIA, and former special military ops such as Navy SEALs. They called out county prosecutors to try to stop us from looking at ballots. And when the prosecutor showed up in the office, he was one of the attorneys of record who had gone to court to try to stop the recount. Not missing a beat, he walks in and I say, oh, did you come to prosecute the Board of Elections? He said, no. My job is to provide legal advice to county officials. So I took off my hat and scratched my head in the best Columbo style and said, I'm a little confused about something here. Maybe you can help me out. I don't mean to cast aspersions on any county officials, but say, for instance, the sheriff had done something wrong. How could you prosecute him if it is your job to provide legal advice to him? This explains to you why we don't get prosecutions at the county level in Ohio, and I understand that you have the same system in Arizona.
Same at the state level also.
Yeah, and at the state level, I might as well continue on this aside. We weren't about to get prosecution from Attorney General Jim Petro because he's supposed to provide legal advice to J. Kenneth Blackwell. Even when he was running against him for governor in the primary, then Mark Dan, a Democrat, succeeded him as Attorney General, and they ousted him because he had an affair. And I don't think we're going to get prosecutions from the FBI or the Justice Department either. So our only hope is what we're trying to do now, to reopen the case in federal court and call witnesses ourselves. I named 30 witnesses, both friendly and hostile, 2 weeks ago in federal district court. So eventually we were allowed to look at one precinct, and they were on their best behavior that day because we had with us a reporter sporting a valid White House press pass. You mean Jeff Gannon? No, although I'd love to know what he used to do every night in order to get his press pass renewed every morning. But no, Jeff was his name, but not Jeff Gannon. I'm sorry to disappoint you. Jeff Kirkby from Cleveland. Anyway, so at that time, Kim Spangler agreed that I could come back in June after their spring primary and photograph more precincts. So I went back to the Adirondack Mountains to clear trails like I do every year and came back. Now, we went back to the Board of Elections, and a number of times actually. On one occasion, we'd been gone for a week, and there was a Global Security Services guard staking out the building. I guess he'd been there all week waiting for our return, because when we pulled in our van, he took off, goes running into the building. So I ran after him. I'm chasing an armed, uniformed paramilitary policeman down the halls of the county office building. And he runs down the hall, he runs around the corner, and he runs into the Board of Elections office and locks the door behind him during business hours. And I see Kim Spangler, the director, scurry across the floor, scoot into her office, and crouch beneath the window in hopes I didn't see her, behavior indicative of someone with something to hide. So, I came back to the law office, and my friend Troy said, well, you need to get a hold of their telephone records to see if they just faxed your records request to Dayton Legal Blank, because maybe they need some more ballots. I think this guy's a lookout. I think they're tampering with the ballots. And yes, indeed they had. They faxed Dayton Legal Blank 10 minutes after that incident. But Troy said that I needed to do things differently. We'd been required to submit public records requests in advance with the precinct specified, giving them a chance to tamper with the evidence. He said I was going to have to look at a precinct with no advance notice. So when I come back from the Adirondack Mountains and I asked Kim, can I look at more precincts? She said, well, yes, but we don't like those ladies you were with. We like you. We want to work with you. Could you resubmit your records request over your name only? I said, oh, sure, Kim. How much time do you need? And she said, give us 24 hours. I said, fine. How about tomorrow? And I resubmitted my records request. I carefully cut and pasted all the townships, and I changed all the precincts. And they didn't notice. We came in the next day, me and Stuart Wright, an elderly gentleman, very quiet and peaceful, couldn't possibly object to him. We were looking to see if there were consecutive runs of ballots, just as there had been in Butler County, and I told Stuart to switch to another number for another candidate as soon as the run ended. Here's the absentee ballots with all the ballots marked number 4 for Bush on the top and all the ballots marked number 6 for Kerry on the bottom. Sorted according to candidate for most of the rest of the deck. Here's the second deck of cards with all the Kerry ballots on top and all the Bush ballots on the bottom. Here's the third deck of cards with a hot pink remake on the top, 3 straggler absentee ballots, and then 359 consecutive ballots for George W. Bush at the bottom of the deck. Not a Kerry ballot in the whole third deck. This is not the sequence in which voters drop their ballots into the box on election night. This was not one of the precincts hand-counted in December, which would be the only valid reason to sort these ballots by candidate. Just like in Butler County, that was not one of the hand-counted precincts. Assuming Kim and Janet didn't do this themselves, it proves unauthorized access to the ballot box, and it also proves ballot tampering. Is it ballot box stuffing? How would we know? We don't even know how many registered voters they had. One more county, Warren County, Ohio. You all heard about this before and again in the movie tonight. Warren County, Ohio. County had not reported their results by midnight. She drove up to find out why and found the building locked down, surrounded by police cars and bomb-sniffing dogs, so she decided to investigate. She asked the principals of the 2 elementary schools, barely a stone's throw from the county office building, if they had been notified of any terrorist threat, and they'd never heard about it. She asked the FBI and the state police, and they didn't know of any terrorist threat in any county in Ohio. She obtained emails back and forth, dated 7 and 8 days before the election, between 2 county officials, the directors of building services and emergency services, planning the lockdown, even deciding upon the wording to be printed on the signs to be posted on the building on election night. She found out that the county commissioners approved the lockdown behind closed doors 5 days before the election, and I found out from questioning the director of the Board of Elections that the board was notified a couple of days before the election that this lockdown was going to happen. And ladies and gentlemen, there is a word for this sort of behavior. It is called conspiracy. Now, we have eyewitnesses. One of them drew a map for the Columbus Free Press of the layout of the buildings. He says that the precinct judges, and I should elaborate here for a second. This is the same story we heard in Delaware County, that the precinct judges carry ballots all by their lonesome from the polling places. And in Ohio, in those days, the precinct judges belonged to whatever party carried that precinct in the previous governor's race. In Delaware County, that was 120 Republicans and 3 Democrats. In Warren County, that was 157 Republicans and 0 Democrats. They carried the ballots all by their lonesome up Justice Drive and up the driveway and across the parking lot, not to the Board of Elections, but to the Building Services Storage Facility, under the control of one of the co-conspirators, the Director of Building Services, and the ballots, according to our eyewitness, were there for 3 or 4 hours while ballot tampering took place, and then the ballots were brought in the back door of the Board of Elections building through the loading dock. Both the reporter and the director of the Board of Elections told me quite independently of each other that these ballots were still arriving at 12:30 in the morning. I checked out the map to see if it was accurate. Note the orientation and the shape of the county building. Here's the Google Earth image. That's a pretty accurate sketch. There's Justice Drive, there's the parking lot, there's the Building Services Storage Facility, there's the loading dock, there's the Board of Elections building. We have ballot accounting charts from numerous precincts in Warren County. The latest hour we have found that ballots left the polls was 9:30 p.m., If ballots were still arriving at 12:30 in the morning, then they did indeed have 3 hours to tamper with the ballots, and that confirms the eyewitness account. Now, what do you think they were doing? Here's what the official results and the ballots tell me. If you take a certain number of ballots, say 30 or 40, punched for carry, from each precinct in the county, and move them one precinct up the list, those punches will be counted for Bush because of ballot rotation. And you will reverse all the two-person races for the ballots you have shifted, a fraction of the ballots for the county. You will cut into the Democrats' vote totals for every race in the county, causing collateral damage to the whole ticket. But some people don't vote for down-ticket races, and some people split their tickets. For instance, for every 40 ballots that were counted for carry, 21 were counted for Ellen Connolly and 9 for Chief Justice Moyer. So if you move 40 carry ballots, you're going to affect the presidential race by 80 votes. You're going to have a net shift of 80 votes. In the presidential race, only 24 in the Chief Justice race. And what do you know? John Kerry gets fewer votes than Ellen Connolly. And ballot initiatives don't rotate. Yes is positioned above no in every precinct, in every punch card county in the state of Ohio. Punches for gay marriage remain punches for gay marriage, and you turn gay-friendly Kerry voters into gay-friendly Bush voters. And Warren was the only county in Ohio, the only punch card county that had both anomalies, where Kerry got fewer votes than Connolly and Bush got more votes than issue 1. We found in 15 audited precincts 400 ballots that were counted for Republican candidates for every single contested office, yet were punched for gay marriage. Straight ticket gay-friendly Republicans. And when we separate out the data sets in Warren and other Connolly anomaly counties, we found that more than half, often 60%, sometimes 2/3, or even 70% of the ballots counted for Ellen Connolly were also counted for Bush, as if 2/3 of her supporters were secret admirers of George W. Bush. And we found in Warren and other counties in Ohio that more than half, in Warren County 51%, of the ballots punched for gay marriage were counted for Bush. And I don't know anybody who believes that if you are a supporter of gay and lesbian marriage, that you are more likely to vote for Bush than for Kerry. How could they do this? They would have, for one thing, the tabulator doesn't know what precincts are being counted. You have to trust the Board of Elections to keep the count straight. How could they survive an audit? They would have to be issuing ballots at the polls with no precinct printed on the backside, and here they are. These are absentee ballots where there's a line in which to write in the precinct. These are regular ballots issued to provisional voters at the polls with the precinct printed on the backside, God knows when. Was it before the election or after the election? These are regular ballots issued at the polls to provisional voters with nothing printed on the backside. There's no line there to write in the precinct as the absentee ballots have. How many of these wild card ballots with no precinct printed on the backside did they have? Well, when they submitted their letter of explanation to Jennifer Bruner as to why they didn't keep all the ballots, we call them the dog ate my homework letters. They said they had 33,000 uncounted ballots. 11,000 of them they called extras, said they didn't keep others. Now, what are extra ballots? I happen to have the packing slip. It's not a very good print. It doesn't show up well on a screen. But the total number of ballots they ordered equals this sum total minus 11,000. They had 11,000 off-the-books ballots in Warren County. I don't know why they brought them to the attention of Secretary Bruner. The other unused ballots, they say, were intentionally destroyed, even before the election was challenged on the floor of the House of Representatives. No, they're not in jail. I don't know how many ballots they had with no precinct printed on the backside, but there shouldn't have been any. They're illegal ballots under Ohio law, and it proves that they had the ability to move those ballots from precinct to precinct before running them through the tabulators. It must have seemed like the perfect crime. It took a needle in a haystack audit of 10,000 ballots to find this evidence, and that's Warren County alone. I know I've kept you too long. I will say that 56 out of 88 counties destroyed at least some of their ballots. Mostly unused ballots, 1 million of those are gone. The blue counties cannot verify that the ballots in the heavily Democratic precincts were not punched in advance because they destroyed their unused ballots. And the red counties cannot verify that fake ballots were not substituted for real ones because they cannot account for their unused ballots. That's why they're supposed to keep them for 22 months. We do believe that we were able to rescue 90% of the voted ballots from destruction, and that's our biggest victory so far. But what happened in Warren County and elsewhere proves the need for paper ballots counted by hand at the polling place in full public view on election night, no matter how long it takes. The fact that these paper ballots are rigged is no reason to get rid of them. It's the reason to keep them. We couldn't have proven fraud in Ohio without the paper ballots. The only reason we could prove fraud in the 15% of the votes that were counted on electronic machines is because of witnesses. We didn't have any paper. But we had 70% cast on punch cards, 15 on optical scanners. The minute those ballots leave the polling place, the opportunity arises for ballot box stuffing, ballot destruction, ballot alteration, and ballot substitution, all of which we documented in Ohio. There will always be a motive to rig an election and win the count. There will always be a means, whatever method of voting is used. Our only hope is to stop the opportunity. Well, thank you. I don't usually get a standing ovation. So if any of you still want the book that haven't bought it, I'll be happy to sign it and personalize it for you. And I think any questions should probably be informal. We're running pretty late. Unless you, I don't know, do you think that's a good idea?
If people want to stay for questions,
you can too.
That would be great. Also, we look forward to hearing from Dr. Phillips on Action Point
I forgot about that.
on Sunday. So, please tune in. And also, you've got books for sale, and if we want to talk with them, maybe we want to talk with them about what are the things that we can do here in Maricopa County, where we're at, and find, meet the witnesses. Essentially, that's what it looks like we're going to be as witnesses. Okay, Mike?
Dr. Phillips, is there a statute of limitation on prosecuting election fraud?
I don't know, but I would assume it hasn't expired, or Cliff Arnebeck would not have wanted to reopen the case.
Right. Second is in regards to Greg Pallas and his contention that the election of 2008 won't be stolen, that it has already been stolen as a function of what you presented to us today and what we know from the past, and there have been no substantive changes in the elections processes since 2006. What's your opinion on that?
Well, it is always dangerous to make predictions, especially about the future. But if there is motive, means, and opportunity and no penalty for cheating, this is never going to stop. I do caution you not to believe everything you see on the internet. I looked into one of those allegations about purging of the voter rolls in Mora County, New Mexico, and unless it happened after May 2008, it never happened at all. Just because a story circulates on the net doesn't mean it's true. But yeah, if voter rolls are purged, then what I said before still goes. You need to re-register your voters rather than wringing your hands about it. And change the law so it doesn't happen the next time. But right now, you got to register your voters.
Okay, Doug?
Yeah, I have a question. What do you think about the total absentee voting system like they have in Oregon? Is that...
I asked them about that. Chain of custody is obviously the problem with absentee voting or mail-in voting. with all mail-in voting, you're sending ballots to people who've died or moved away. Presumably, they're not to be forwarded, so they come back to you. You got to have somebody to verify the signatures for every single ballot, so it's complicated. I don't know. They seem on balance to like it in Oregon and in a lot of Washington counties, but I would rather have ballots counted at the polling place. I mean, it seems to me the reason states are going to mail-in voting is because there's no election day holiday. If we had election on a Saturday or something, or 2 days, Saturday and Sunday, we probably wouldn't need mail-in voting.
Or declare a holiday.
Yeah, or declare a holiday, although some of the entrepreneurs won't want to have another paid holiday. So you will have to deal with that argument, which is maybe why we're better off having it on a weekend. But, yeah.
How much would you say you've spent on this investigation and legal fees and everything, and how much do you think it'll wind up being?
Well, I don't know how much anybody else has spent. The entire amount I received in contributions and compensation in the first 2 years was a bit under $13,000, and most of my expenses came out of that. I haven't seen a dime since September of 2006, except for sales of the book, and occasionally when people take up collections to defray my travel expenses. I might add that the blackout in the news media extends to the publishing industry. At one time, I had 3 publishers vying for my manuscript. I chose to go with Kent State University Press for a number of reasons, and 4 days after the first public announcement that they were going to publish the book no later than spring of 2008, which appeared as a page 1 banner headline in one of my hometown newspapers, Kent State University Press sent me an email breaking the contract with enough false statements in it that I don't know the real reasons. So already traumatized and exhausted, we had to do all the typesetting, all the formatting, all the editing, all the graphics, and come up with $26,000 to put this book out in a nice hardbound edition. My research will not fall apart, and neither will the book.
You said you had a question earlier?
Yes.
I just wonder about early mail-in voting.
Yeah.
In your opinion, is that a bit safer?
Well, chain of custody is the question. You know, you have how many weeks now that you have to watch the ballots or have somebody watch them to make sure that they're that the chain of custody is secure? That's always the question. All ballot tampering takes place when the chain of custody breaks down, which is why I'd rather have them counted at the polling place. So if you're going to have early voting, that's what you're going to have to deal with. You're going to have to figure out some way to secure the chain of custody and make sure that there is no way that those ballots can be altered or substituted. And you know, what was being discussed earlier today about counties actually having the ability to print their own ballots is a pretty scary thing.
Yeah, we have that right.
Yeah, I saw it in Ohio too. I mean, some of those, I think Mercer County printed their ballots. I mean, I don't know for sure, but it sure looks like it to me.